The Harry Potter films will hold a place in cinema for years to come, and they are some of the best film adaptations ever made. My journey with the film started when I was just 5 years old, and now 21 years later, I decided to make my love letter to this incredible movie series. I've watched and gone through these movies too many times to count, especially since making this channel, and with repeated viewings, I've noticed many details that are almost poetic. George Lucas said it best, something like this is like poetry, the 8 films rhyme.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
I don't know if all of this was done on purpose, but I've noticed small details here and there that connect each movie in a beautiful way. Now, I know I normally focus my videos on the books and not the films, but for this video, I'm looking at just the movies because a lot of what I'm going to say has nothing to do with the novels. These decisions were made solely by the filmmakers. Also, I will not be talking about the Fantastic Beasts films, I'm sticking just to the 8 movies. So without further ado, let's get into it. If you look at just the first film, it's great. It's the perfect opening to a film franchise. However, when you mix the first movie with the 7 other films, it all of a sudden becomes more than great. It becomes fantastic. This is due in large part to the filmmakers flawlessly connecting each movie with the other. For example, in the first movie, we see Harry playing with these knights in the cupboard under the stairs, which is a great scene. But the filmmakers made it mean so much more with this scene in Deathly Hallows Part 1. It sends a wave of nostalgia to both Harry and the audience as he revisits his old toys from before he even started his wizarding journey. And they don't just stop there. While he's looking at these knights in both movies, he all of a sudden hears a noise and he sticks his head out of the cupboard to see what it is. They made these scenes rhyme in a beautiful way, making both have so much more meaning. As we start our journey, director Chris Columbus set the stage for how this universe would look, and the directors that followed perfectly blended their own vision with Chris's. For example, it became a tradition to show the outside of the Hogwarts Express in each movie. That's something we always see, even when Harry himself wasn't on it in the Deathly Hallows. It also became a staple to reveal Hogwarts in a certain way, and with the exception of the 5th film, there's always something leading us to the first shot of the school in each film. In the first film it was the boats, in the second it was the car, in the third it was the carriages, in the fourth it was the train, in the 6th it was the flying Death Eaters, and in the last film it was the flying Dementors.
Welcome home.
Interestingly, I noticed that for the first 4 films, they showed less and less of their journey to Hogwarts. The first film started by showing all of King's Cross.
What are you looking at?
The second started at the entrance of platform 9 3/4.
Train will be leaving any moment.
The third didn't show any of King's Cross, but went right to platform 9 3/4.
For goodness sake, don't lose him!
And the 4th film didn't show any of that, but cut right to the train, skipping everything with the platform and King's Cross. While we're talking about the beginning, another interesting observation of firsts in the movies is Dumbledore's first reveal in each film. When Harry sees him for the first time in each film, his entrances always show him as this powerful figure, whether he's silencing the Great Hall in the 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 5th films, or taking command of the situation in the 2nd film.
As it is,
They are not.
And even making this almost mind-blowing appearance out of nowhere in the 6th film. However, his final appearance is much more simple, and there's nothing powerful or spectacular about it. He just calmly walks up, and this shows how the dynamic between himself and Harry has changed. In the first 6 films, Harry saw him as this all-powerful man, which was represented in his introductions. But now, Harry isn't a kid anymore, he's older, which puts the two of them on equal footing. And on top of that, they met in this place because both did the unthinkable and willingly faced and embraced their deaths knowing it was coming. With this new dynamic, they're equals. There's no longer a need for this powerful Dumbledore entrance like all of the other films had to have.
Harry, you wonderful boy. You brave, brave man.
These movies excelled at portraying Harry's parents and parent figures in this very rhythmical way. There's this wonderful element of seeing all of these father figures putting their hands on Harry's shoulders. We saw Sirius do it in the 3rd and 5th film, we saw Arthur Weasley do it in the 3rd film, and we saw Dumbledore do it in the 4th and 6th films. Then in the final film, when Harry's all grown up, he takes what all of his father figures did for him and he puts his hand on his son's shoulder. It comes full circle. There's also this beautiful element with Harry and Sirius. At the end of the 3rd film, Sirius says,
"The ones that love us never really leave us. And you can always find them in here."
He touches Harry's heart, telling him that his deceased loved ones, like his parents, would never leave him. Then Sirius himself of course died and came back in the final film where he said,
We're here, you see.
and notice he said we, now referring to himself as one of Harry's fallen loved ones, which was not the case when he said that line initially. It's such an amazing detail that shows how much can change, but at the same time can stay exactly the same. Another representation of children left without parents are mirrors. The first time Harry saw his parents after their death was of course in the Mirror of Erised. That in itself is very compelling, but the fifth film added so much more to this mirror and parent dynamic as they showed Neville looking at a picture of his parents in the mirror in the Room of Requirement. He too stands in front of his own reflection and sees the parents he lost. In his case though, his parents didn't die but lost their minds, which might actually be worse. But notice how Harry was there to give Neville comfort, something he didn't have in his own mirror experience when he saw his parents.
We're gonna make them proud, Neville. That's a promise.
The Mirror of Erised scene is also one of my favorite scenes in this film franchise, and one thing that makes it so tragic is Harry reaching out to touch his mother, but then realizing he couldn't. This devastating realization was then replicated in the final film as he had his mother standing right in front of him, but again, when he reached out, he realized he couldn't touch her. It's yet another example that shows just how much can change from the first to the last film, but again, at the same time, nothing has changed at all. Another pair of poetic scenes I want to talk about is in the third and fifth movie. In both, Harry storms into his room and angrily punches or kicks something. However, the focus of the scene quickly shifts from Harry's anger to the photograph on his bedside table, the same exact picture of his parents in both movies, which immediately calms him down. The same parallel can be said about the scenes with the Patronuses. While in the woods, Harry sees a Patronus from afar, one of a stag, which represents his father, and one of a doe, which represents his mother. Relationships in the Harry Potter films are so perfectly done. The job they did with the trio is one of my favorite parts of this film franchise. Just looking at the simple things, you can draw so many scene parallels like them walking through the courtyard or sitting on the train, the three of them laughing together, the three of them running down to Hagrid's, and the list just goes on and on. These movies have made an abundance of scenes that could be matched up, simply telling the story and showing the growth of the trio's friendship, and it's honestly magical. Looking deeper, I noticed a number of things that strengthen their bond, specifically with rescues. We see every combination possible. In the first movie, we see Ron and Harry run in to rescue Hermione.
Hermione, move!
In the third film, we see Harry and Hermione run in to rescue Ron.
Ron, you're okay.
And in the fifth film, we see Ron and Hermione run in to help save Harry, which they of course do just by being there.
You're the weak one, and you'll never know love or friendship.
And how could we forget about the trio in McGonagall's office in The Half-Blood Prince, which is a callback to them being there in the very first film, and McGonagall's line is just the icing on the cake for this scene.
Why is it, when something happens, it is always you three?
Believe me, Professor, I've been asking myself the same question for 6 years.
There's a great parallel at the end of the first and eighth movie. It's the last look we get of them at Hogwarts for both, and in the first one, as they stand together, Hermione looks off in the distance. Then in the final film, it's the same thing, but Ron is the one to look off in the distance. One of my favorite trio parallels again takes place at the end of the first and last movie. Harry walks up to see Ron and Hermione, and in both, Ron and Hermione look up at him smiling, and in the last shot, Harry smiles right back at them, and in the final film, it's him being happy for them finally being together. There's also the hugging scenes between Harry and Hermione. In the Chamber of Secrets, she hugs him saying, "Hello, I missed you." And then in the final film, Hermione hugs him goodbye saying, "I will miss you," as she lets Harry go off to his death. The same can be said about Harry and Hagrid. We see things come full circle as they perfectly parallel their hugging scene at the end of the second and last movie. It shows that Hagrid is and always will be there for Harry no matter what. We can also look at a much darker Harry and Hagrid moment, like Hagrid carrying baby Harry versus Hagrid carrying the supposedly dead, grown-up Harry. It's also poetic that the first time Harry went to the Dursleys, Hagrid brought him there in his motorbike, and when he leaves the Dursleys for the last time, it was again Hagrid taking him on the exact same motorbike.
I brought you here 16 years ago when you were no bigger than a bow truckle. Seems only right that I should be the one to take you away now.
Another small thing I loved was Harry running into the crowd in the first film as he's embraced and cheered on, and then 7 years later, a crowd again forms around Harry, but in a much different circumstance, as this time they're crowding around him to protect him. There are also just small moments that play off one another from film to film, like Hermione always fixing Harry's glasses, or father figures cheersing to Harry. The movies also excelled at adding scenes to make Ron and Hermione's journey feel more complete than they did in the book. Some were small parallels, like Ron wiping something off Hermione's face, or Ron holding Hermione when she needed to be held, or even just adding small moments like Hermione reaching for Ron's hand when she was scared. Visually though, I think the best addition to their relationship was the piano scene, as Ron just loses himself while looking at Hermione. But going past visuals, they also added lines that enhance and develop their relationship just as much as the visuals.
If she looked over here and saw you snugging me, would you expect her to get up and leave?
Harry,
Sorry, Liam, I know what I'm doing.
did you hear what she was saying back at the pub about me and her slugging?
I also loved the added Ron and Harry scenes. I like to point out all the times the two were laughing next to each other because it just really highlights the lighter side of their friendship. I also love the small detail of the two boys desperately running to class in the first movie, and then in the sixth film, they're just taking their sweet old time to get to class. There are also small moments the two share, but not together, and what I mean by that is they have very similar experiences. For instance, they both dominate on the Quidditch pitch, and there's a 360 shot that goes around them as the crowd cheers their name. There's also the parallel of both of them being celebrated in the Gryffindor common room. But my favorite part of their friendship in the films was Ron always being the one to talk sense into Harry, but in a way that shows he's there for him.
You may be the chosen one, mate, but this is a whole lot bigger than that. It's always been bigger than that.
Though it's not your typical relationship, Harry and Voldemort did have a strong one in the series. It's a theme throughout the films that he and Harry are very similar. We see this in almost every film.
You see, sir, I couldn't help but notice certain things, certain similarities between Tom Riddle and me.
Perhaps the most significant part of their interesting relationship was when Voldemort took over Harry's body, which in my opinion is probably the best change from book to movie throughout all 8 films. It's just so powerful.
Harry, it isn't how you are like. It's how you are not.
But that's an obvious detail that almost everyone notices. What I want to talk about is a much smaller detail. We see this dream sequence, and in it, Voldemort does this little neck twitch to the side, and this then becomes the visual representation of Voldemort being in Harry's head. Every time Harry can feel Voldemort, he does that same neck twitch, first after he felt a spark of anger and yelled at Ron, then right before he said his famous "look at me" line.
Look at me!
He also does it when he senses Voldemort coming to the Ministry, and we see it in another dream sequence as Harry's face becomes Voldemort.
Look at me.
And this even carries into the Half-Blood Prince as well. He does that same neck twitch when the ring Horcrux gets near him. It's a small detail, but it carries a lot of weight visually in the films. Another amazing relationship in the films is Harry and Dumbledore's. One thing I noticed is that Dumbledore is almost always on the left side of Harry when they talk. There are so many examples of this, I was shocked at how well this observation panned out. However, there is one exception, because in the Goblet of Fire, he's always on Harry's right side. After thinking about it though, this makes perfect sense, because this film is the turning point in the series. The war has begun, and nothing will be the same. Hermione said it best.
Everything's going to change now, isn't it?
Yes.
So Dumbledore being on the right side in this film makes perfect sense, because just like the story, everything changes with the visuals as well. I noticed the same thing for Ginny too. Every time she and Harry hug or kiss, Harry is always on the right and Ginny is always on the left side. Now, I don't know if these things were done on purpose, but it's still cool to point them out.
Brilliant.
Adapting a book to the big screen is no easy task, and for the most part, they did a great job. The thing that really makes these movies stand out was the filmmakers understanding how they could mold the story utilizing the medium of film, so basically, things that the books could not do. One of my favorite examples of this is how they use cameras. They use these camera flashes in a variety of ways, mainly for transitions. One example is using just one single flash to jump from Ron in bed to the photo shoot with Rita Skeeter. It's simple but very effective. They also use cameras at the beginning of both the 6th and 7th films, both scenes actually taking place in the exact same room. And here they use flashes in a very similar way, but instead of changing the entire scene, each flash simply changes the shot. It goes from Dumbledore's arm around Harry to the photographers to Harry and Dumbledore's back and then to the title of the movie. Again, simple but very effective. And the 7th movie did the same thing, going from Scrimgeour's face to a close-up of his back and then to a wide shot of the entire ministry. Another cool transition used in the movies, which is incredibly cinematic, is the use of glass. If you go through it, it could start a scene, end a scene, show something crucial, and sometimes can just be there to look cool. I think the best example of this was done by Alfonso Cuarón with the mirror in the wardrobe, a shot I actually studied in one of my classes in film school. Another technique that could only be done on film is the wind effect when magic is used. They only use it a handful of times, but it's used in one of the most famous scenes in the whole series when Harry gets his wand. It was also used in the 3rd film when Harry blew up his aunt, and in the 2nd film when he was pulled out of the diary. It adds this physical presence of magic, which I think was done fabulously, and I honestly wish they used this effect more. The use of certain locations is another example of utilizing the medium you're given. The movies created the bridge location, which wasn't in the book, and it's used quite often in many different ways. It can be used for deep conversations where they stay in one place, excited conversations as they walk across, and of course the place for the battle that would end in its destruction.
You're actually giving us permission to do this?
That is correct, Longbottom.
To blow it up? Boom! Boom!
And speaking of the bridge, I also loved how the filmmakers created this running gag of Seamus always blowing things up.
I'll do the counter curse. No, that's all I need. You to set my bloody kneecaps on fire. I don't appreciate the insinuation, Longbottom. Besides, if anyone cares to notice, my eyebrows have completely grown back.
It's a gag that continues throughout the movie series, and ultimately it led to the bridge's destruction, and perhaps Neville's most badass moment in the movies.
That went well.
Neville's character was handled so well in the films, and that has a lot to do with what the filmmakers decided to add to his character that was not in the books. On top of the bridge scene, they also added him standing up to the Death Eaters on the train, and of course to Bellatrix.
Neville Longbottom, is it? How's Mum and Dad?
Better now they're about to be avenged.
My favorite little added moment though are 2 scenes that correspond so well in the 1st and 5th movie. In both, Neville does something good, and all of a sudden, everyone starts clapping for him while he's just dumbfounded. Then with everyone cheering around him, he gives this proud little smile. I also have to applaud the filmmakers on some of their foreshadowing when it comes to dialogue. They plant a line earlier in the film.
Is there something you wish to tell me?
No, sir.
And then have it pay off later in the movie.
Is there something you wish to tell me?
No, sir.
There are tons of examples of this, almost none of which appeared in the novels. My favorite is probably Sirius's last words. In a flashback, he says,
Nice one, James.
and then his last line seconds before he died is the exact same thing.
Nice one, James.
There's also the I must not tell lies line, as Umbridge tells Harry to write this with a special pen that cuts his hand.
I want you to write, I must not tell lies.
And then later, Harry says it right back to her when the Centaurs have her.
Tell them I mean no harm.
I'm sorry, Professor. I must not tell lies.
And this gets even deeper when Harry actually says this again in the Deathly Hallows Part 1.
You're lying, Dolores. And one mustn't tell lies.
Another example is when we hear Bellatrix mock Harry after she killed Sirius. And we see this again in the next film as Bellatrix says the exact same line as Harry chases her. The filmmakers also had Snape's famous line of always be said by Lily as well, which puts a nice bow on their story arc together.
Always.
Always.
There are also a few of these that were said in the book, like Ron and Hermione's cute tagline.
Always the tone of surprise.
Always the tone of surprise.
But the films did change how that line was said. There was also Ollivander's famous line in the first and last movie.
The wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter.
The wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter.
And of course Dumbledore's famous line that was said in the second and last film, which he also changed a little bit in the last movie, which I always loved.
You will find that help will always be given at Hogwarts to those who ask for it.
Help will always be given at Hogwarts, Harry, to those who ask for it. But I would in this case amend my original statement to this. Help will always be given at Hogwarts to to those who deserve it.
These films use very visual things to lighten the mood or to add comic relief. I already mentioned Seamus with the explosions, but there's also a theme of using smacking to have comic relief as well.
Okay, sorry. Kidding.
Dancing is another thing that these films latched onto, normally to lighten the mood. It could show love for one another, it could be choreographed and organized, random and fun, awkward and hilarious, and even used to mock someone else's dancing.
Oi. Never gonna let him forget this, are you? Never.
One thing interesting to look at is the final shot of each movie. I noticed that each ending can be matched up with another ending in the series, and each one has a pair out of the 8 movies. The first and fifth films both go from Hogsmeade Station to moving the camera up to a shot of Hogwarts. The second and third films both cut from people clapping to a faraway shot of Hogwarts. The fourth and seventh films both end looking out at the Great Lake. And finally, the sixth and eighth films both end on a shot of the trio. Each ending shot also perfectly captures the essence of said movie, and besides the last one, none of them have the same ending as the book, which is just a prime example of how well they utilize the medium of film, making it their own. These films have a wealth of visual techniques that just flow so well from movie to movie. For example, every time we're introduced to a new place, we view it from behind the main characters' backs, as it either pans sideways or tilts vertically. There are also many amazing shots of characters with their backs silhouetted in the frame, and it makes for very powerful and ominous visuals. They use this to show loneliness, companionship, intensity, and even the end of the film. And going off of that, I noticed a ton of similar shots that all 4 directors used, most notably the use of what's called tilting, or going up and down in a vertical motion. My favorite example of this are the 2 shots on the bridge. They just line up so perfectly. They also use the tilting motion to show something in the sky, to show a person's full body, to show the chaos in the final shot of the scene, to make a nice transition to the next scene, or even to show how vast a certain area is, like the Ministry or the maze in the Triwizard Tournament. What I really want to highlight though are certain scenes that match up flawlessly from film to film, most notably the Gringotts scene. It starts with the wide shot of the bank as it follows the back of the 2 characters walking in. It then cuts to a shot of their feet walking as they approach the front. After that, it pans over the goblins at their desk, and notice how both shots are moving to the left. They match up so well. It then shows the goblin at the front desk looking up, then a shot of the goblin's point of view looking down at the heroes. The 2 scenes rhyme like poetry so perfectly, just as George Lucas said.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Another example of this is the forest scene in the first and last film. The scene starts with Voldemort, or the face that holds Voldemort, turning toward Harry. It then shows Harry's reaction to this, and notice how in the first film he backs away, but in the last film he actually walks toward Voldemort, accepting his destiny. It perfectly highlights how far he has come on this journey. We then see Voldemort square up to Harry, and again we see Harry's reaction to this. He's terrified in the first movie, but doesn't even flinch in the last one. After that, we see a shot that shows Voldemort on the far side and Harry's full body in front of him. Then this is where the action starts, as in the first film he's saved by Firenze, while in the last film he's killed because no one's there to protect him this time. Another amazing visual detail is that of Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks. The last time we see them, they're reaching for each other's hands, but they never connect. Then the next time we see them, it's after they've been killed, and their hands are just as we had left them, right next to each other, but not touching. Another thing I noticed in the final film was something to do with Harry, Voldemort, and Neville. During the final battle, we have a shot of Voldemort's eye on the left side, and a shot of Harry's eye on the right. Then we see both of Neville's eyes in the middle, showing that he's the bridge that will decide their fate, which ultimately he is, as he evened the playing field by killing Voldemort's last Horcrux. It's a powerful visual representation of how their fates are all intertwined. I also noticed a ton of examples of dramatic head turns. There are friendly head turns, scared head turns, curious head turns, suspenseful head turns, intimidating ones, evil ones, upset ones, and so on. These head turns are almost tradition, and they're used in just about every way imaginable throughout the series. I also found an interesting pattern with doors in the series. Opening doors can represent power and authority, while closing doors can represent secrecy and deception. Also, in the only 2 films that feature all of the Order of the Phoenix, both films had their introduction be them walking through a doorway. Both the 3rd and 5th films used the same playground to visualize what Harry was feeling. In the 3rd film, they used the playground to build suspense, which also represented Harry's fear. Then in the 5th film, they again use the playground, but this time to show Harry's loneliness. Also, at the beginning of both of these films, they used flickering lights to alert Harry that danger was coming. One of the most intriguing shots that I've never heard anyone talk about is when Voldemort glided his fingers over his forearm, which is where the dark mark would go. It shows that though his Death Eaters work for him, there's a huge gap between himself and his followers. It's an interesting character moment that I think adds a lot to his overall story and is something that was never really in the books. Severus Snape is one of the most complex characters in the series. No one can really get a read on him, not even Voldemort, and they represent this perfectly in two beautiful shots as both Bellatrix and the Dark Lord walk around Severus trying to figure him out. There are also these two scenes that feature Snape, and it's easy to see just how much these two scenes parallel one another. Both involve Snape looking out on the courtyard by himself, and they both show a close-up of his face, which just has a world of emotions from Alan Rickman. The scene in the 8th movie also houses another interesting parallel as we see Dementors hovering outside of Hogwarts, which is very similar to another shot that we saw in the 3rd movie. When looking at Dumbledore's speech in the 3rd and 6th films, the camera zooms in on him as he speaks, and in the 3rd film, Dumbledore is addressing Harry, while in the 6th film, he addresses Draco by what he says.
Give them no reason to harm you. It is not in the nature of a Dementor to be forgiving. In the end, their greatest weapon is you.
So what they did perfectly was have the camera zoom in on whichever boy the speech would resonate with the most. And while we're talking about different shots, let's discuss the use of the point of view shot. Two different directors in two different movies used this technique to perfection. First, in the 4th film, Mike Newell used this technique to make the audience feel as judged as Harry felt in that moment.
He's a cheat!
And then in the 5th film, David Yates used the same technique to make the audience feel how much hatred was brought upon Harry. One cool detail I noticed, which is scattered throughout all 8 films, is the use of windows to express Harry's emotions. The coolest example is Harry looking out of the Dursleys' window in the 1st and last film as he moves the exact same curtain in both. These two shots line up perfectly. While these two shots convey Harry's curiosity, others like this show Harry's nervousness for his first day of wizarding school, his anger at the Dursleys, his mixed emotions after hearing his mother's voice on the train, and his mischievous planning to break the rules and go into Hogsmeade when he wasn't supposed to. They use fire in a similar way, again to show Harry's emotions. We see his disappointment as he watches his Hogwarts letter burn. We see him staring into the fire, wishing he could have his parents back after seeing them in the Mirror of Erised for the first time. We see his anger manifest about Sirius Black.
He was right there. He was close enough to touch. I could have killed him.
We see how shaken up he is about Crouch's death.
He was murdered at Hogwarts. This is a big deal.
We see his disappointment after being turned down by Cho, we see his loneliness in the 5th film, and we see how worried he is later in the same movie. They use windows and fireplaces to great use, and it really helps convey the emotion Harry is feeling in each scene. One of the most difficult things to do was to transition from one part of your movie to another, and amazingly, all 4 directors of these films used a bird to do so at one point. Chris Columbus used Hedwig to transition from winter to spring. Alfonso Cuarón did the opposite, using Hedwig to transition from fall to winter. Mike Newell used Hedwig to transition from the beginning of the train ride to the end. And David Yates used the crow to transition from real life to the Deathly Hallows animation. It's clear just how much these directors worked off one another, as they were able to keep the same styles, staples, and techniques while also adding their own flair to each film. And as I keep saying, it makes all these films rhyme together like poetry. But perhaps the most powerful visuals in the series were the ones to do with death. After almost every death, the filmmakers made sure that there was somebody being held in this vulnerable moment. We saw Harry lying on Cedric's body, and later Albus holding both Harry and Amos. When Sirius died, we saw Lupin holding a grieving Harry. When Dumbledore died, we saw Ginny holding Harry. When Lily died, we saw Snape holding her. When Dobby died, we saw Harry holding Dobby. When Fred died, we saw Ron and Molly holding Fred, and later we saw Hermione holding Ron. And this is even true for Harry's death. We saw him being held by Hagrid. Every one of these shots made each death so much more heartbreaking, and it shows just how much a visual representation can affect the story and the audience in such a powerful way. Throughout these 8 movies, there's a theme of dominance. A really interesting example of this is in the 1st film. Vernon has complete dominance over Harry. He grabs him by his hair, and Harry is helpless. Fast forward 2 years though, and in the exact same hallway, Harry is the dominant one now while Vernon feels helpless. The roles were completely reversed. Something similar happens with Voldemort. Throughout the 8 movies, Voldemort is almost always above, looking down at Harry. We saw this when he was a baby, when they faced each other in the first film, the second film, the fourth film, and the fifth film. However, in the last movie, the roles are again reversed, as Harry is looking down at what is left of Voldemort. He is now the dominant one. The same technique is used for McGonagall and Umbridge. The two have a power struggle as they take turns going up one step to gain the higher ground, until McGonagall realizes she doesn't want to stoop to Umbridge's level, which then allows Umbridge to take the upper hand. I also love the theme of the floating Voldemort heads, which we saw in the first film, the fifth film, the seventh film, and the eighth film. It adds this very intimidating aspect to Voldemort's character, which I think the films did brilliantly. And going off of that, another huge form of dominance in the movies are things in the clouds. We see the Grimms stare down at Harry, and we see the dark mark several times in the clouds, which was an interesting choice given the fact that in the books they're described as green light, not a cloud formation, but I think having it in the clouds makes it even more ominous and intimidating. Creatures cast a huge light of dominance in the series as well. Notice how whenever there's a scene with Dementors, they are always above their victims. They are the definition of dominance in these films. Then we also see how important and dominant they are when they save the heroes in almost every movie. We saw Firenze save Harry in the first film, Fawkes blind the Basilisk and take them out of the chamber in the second, saw Buckbeak save Harry and Hermione from Lupin's werewolf form in the third, saw Fawkes rescue Dumbledore in the fifth, saw Dobby rescue Harry and Company in Deathly Hallows Part 1, and the dragon save the trio from Gringotts in the eighth.
That was brilliant! Absolutely brilliant!
Like everything else in the series, a lot of the action scenes rhyme from movie to movie. Let's look at some examples. The escape from the Hall of Prophecies and the escape from the Ministry is a prime example of this. The shots line up so perfectly. We see the thing they'll run from start to fall or escape. We see one hero grabbing another as they run. We see a front-facing shot of them running. We get an overhead shot of the heroes running away from the camera, see the threat gaining on them, and then see them escape through a door. These over-the-shoulder running shots are another staple in the Harry Potter films. We see it over and over again in almost every movie. And again, the theme of this video, these films rhyme like poetry. Another example of action scenes matching up are the Gringotts and Department of Mystery sequences, as Hermione catches them all in the exact same way when they fall. And the same can be said about the Burrow and the Lovegoods house. It was attacked and knocked down in the same way. Looking at the Battle of Seven Potters, it pays tribute to Ron and Harry flying the car, as the person driving goes upside down. There's a shot of Harry falling out, a wide shot of Harry just hanging on from the vehicle, a close-up of his face, Harry getting back in, and his reaction to all of this. A lot of the duels house similar shots and angles that match up really nicely when comparing all of these scenes. Same with the water scenes. There's almost always a shot of Harry rising above the water, and it's always framed in the same way in the picture. They also perfectly match Harry flying over the courtyard to applause the same way Fred and George did 2 movies later. Not to mention Sirius and Bellatrix's escape. We see both of them in their cell looking out, see the explosion that opens it, and see a shot of them laughing and free. And these parallels aren't always exactly the same. For example, we have similar moments in the 5th and 7th film as Lupin is holding Harry in the chaos. In the 5th film, he tries to keep Harry there, but in the 7th film, he does the opposite and pushes Harry away. And here's another example. In the underground Gringotts scenes, the first film just has them on a straight path and they go very slowly. It complements the feel of the scene, there's not much suspense. Then in the 8th film, it's a wild ride, which again complements the suspense in that scene. They're complete opposites. A lot of these action scenes end in a very similar way. For instance, a lot of these scenes end with Harry getting knocked out or lying on the floor. We saw this at the end of the climax in the first film, after the Dementor attack in the third, after the Death Eater rampage in the fourth, after Voldemort took him over in the fifth, and after his fight with Snape at the end of the sixth film. It's almost like a pattern that each film follows, and it makes the series flow together so nicely. The amazing thing about the Harry Potter films is that it adds so much lore to the franchise and sometimes even changes how we see the books. For instance, Luna and Neville's relationship. That's something that was not in the books, but because of the films, fans cling on to them as a couple. There are actually a lot of things I like better in the films than in the books, which I've talked a lot about on this channel, but if you haven't seen any of my other work, I far prefer Sirius's character arc in the 5th film rather than the 5th book, because he's made so much nicer, more supportive, and much more loving. I also far prefer the Battle of the Department of Mysteries in the movie than the book because it keeps the team together and I love that about it. It shows unity. I also like how they handled the Elder Wand in the last movie. Instead of putting it back in Dumbledore's grave, Harry destroyed it, ensuring that there was no possible way it could fall into someone else's hands. These movies have been, and always will be, among my favorite movies ever made. I have a deep connection to the films, and so do so many others. I hope you guys enjoyed me sharing my thoughts on the movies. After making videos with these films for over 12 years between this channel and my first channel, I've certainly studied these movies more than most, and my hope is that I pointed out at least one thing you didn't notice before. Let me know in the comments if you have any other thoughts that I didn't discuss. I'd love to hear your opinions and ideas. For now, that's all I have for you though. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe button if you enjoyed this breakdown, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. You can follow me on Instagram to see more of my personal life, like my cute dog Loki, and some behind the scenes movie flame stuff. I also do similar content on TikTok and Twitter that I do here on this channel, so if you like what I do here, check them out. All the handles are right below me, and links are in the description. Over here are my wonderful patrons. If you want to be featured on the next video, plus get a few other perks, become a patron today. As always, if you liked the video, hit that like button and subscribe, and look out for more great Movie Flame videos on the way.